Hello and welcome to another episode of Parliamentary Conversations in the Commonwealth, the CPA's podcast focusing on some of the most critical issues facing Parliament and parliamentarians today. This episode features Adriana Quiñones, who currently serves as the Head of Human Rights and Development at UN Women. We spoke with Adriana ahead of the Commonwealth Secretariat CPA Joint Dialogue on Empowering Young Women in Politics, which took place in May 2026. Adriana Quiñones, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Parliamentary Conversations in the Commonwealth. To start with, could you introduce yourself to our audience? What's your background and what brought you to your work on human rights?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to be in this podcast. I have been looking forward to coming to the Commonwealth for the event that we have tomorrow on young women's participation, but also to share the work of UN Women that we have launched with the Commonwealth and especially with the CPA last year, with a manual, a handbook that I will share about later on ending discriminatory laws. But to share with you, I'm from Colombia. And growing up in a country where war has been present for more than 50 years, it really struck me how the different positions of women as caretakers, as frontline, as survivors, as developers of legislation, as entrepreneurs, was not really recognized, and that they were carrying the burden of the conflict, and yet they were always pursuing solutions collectively in peaceful ways. Also, the ability of women to come together in difficult situations, but also the fact that indigenous women, Afro-descendant women, women with disabilities were greatly discriminated against. They never had a voice in parliament. They didn't have a voice in government. And I started looking at how peace agreements could perhaps help support women's leadership so that we can build more egalitarian societies so that there's opportunity for everyone. So I have been working at the UN for 20 years now. In different capacities, I worked in New York as manager of a trust fund to end violence against women and girls, later in Bangkok, later in Panama as a regional advisor, and then as country representative in Guatemala. My work there with indigenous women, with supporting the implementation of the peace process, even 25 years after it had been signed, really shifted my perspective and looking at the importance of the work that happens in Geneva with the Human Rights Council, with the treaty bodies and human rights mechanisms. I decided to go there, and now I lead our work on human rights, rule of law, and non-discrimination.
Great. Yep. That's a really useful introduction. I was interested in what you were talking about collective action as well. One thing I wanted to ask you about was the recent Commission on the Status of Women session, something you've been involved with, and it brought together women from across the world with the aim of ending discriminatory laws by 2030. What are some of the most common or pernicious of these laws, and what kind of role is UN Women playing in trying to get them removed?
Yes, that's an exciting question, because the Commission of the Status of Women decides its work plan for the next 3 years, and they thought about care being a very important element of women's work and participation, also as a right. They thought about how are we going to accomplish the SDGs by 2030, and then they thought on access to justice. But the reaction very quickly became that we needed to work for CSW 70 on access to justice and non-discrimination. So that really put us on a space where we realized that there's still, all women in the world are facing discriminatory laws. There's no country that is protecting against any form of discrimination still after all these years, after all the work. We have just completed 35 years of the CEDAW committee, and even though there has been progress, we see that women still face incredible amounts of violence. They don't have rights to inheritance, for example. In some countries, they are barred from some occupations that will provide their ability to provide an income to their household, education, and health to their children. There are barriers to political participation, and women are still, for example, increasingly being victims of unfair incarceration because they are linked to criminal networks and exploitation. So it's really an overwhelming sense that women are facing many different human rights violations that we are not necessarily protecting them.
Another thing you had mentioned as well was that you're here to attend this panel co-organized by the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association and the Commonwealth Secretariat. And this is focusing more on empowering young women in politics. In your view, what are some of the chief barriers to young women entering politics today? And how does this interact with those discriminatory laws that you were just talking about?
So we see as discriminatory laws the inability, for example, to confer your nationality to your spouse and children in some countries, 24 countries around the world to be exact. The fact that we're not protecting young women from child marriage. We're still, a lot of countries, we don't have legislation against this harmful practice, female genital mutilation, or even violence against women. There are many countries that have passed domestic violence laws, but crimes like femicide that we see increasingly in every country around the world, there are not many countries that have really looked into that. So lack of protection we see also as a discrimination, or specific barriers for women entering into, for example, non-traditional fields, or the inability to inherit land, for example, is something that we see a lot. So to me, the fact that young women do not necessarily know that the future cannot be taken for granted, that these protections that are not universal can be taken away from us, is already a barrier. In political parties, the way that they are organized, they tend to favor politicians with previous networks, with alliances that not necessarily interest young women and girls. It sounds complicated. It requires a lot of effort in terms of resource mobilization, of political acumen, and many times women are not socialized to be outgoing, to be entrepreneurial in the pursuit of their political career. And so also we see lots and increasingly violence against young women and women in politics overall. We have done studies at UN Women that demonstrate that women tend to be threatened with life threats. They are attacked online, their reputation is tarnished. And of course, once you enter in politics, you know that your life is going to be public. So this really deters women. The fact that there are not many facilities for women who have children, that it's not looked upon well if a woman brings their children to work, things like this, there is not an infrastructure that is telling women that entering in politics will protect them from harassment, will ensure them some ability to balance their work and their family life. And I think this is what is deterring them mostly.
Right. And then to drill down into that specific idea of youth representation, we've seen not only that this has progressed unevenly across the globe, but in some cases, we've even seen stagnation or decline in the amount of youth that are represented in parliaments. Why do you think that countries are seeing these declines? Is this just a result of aging populations, or is there something else at play here?
I think we have taken democracy for granted, and I think that young women and young people in general are not necessarily seeing their issues identified with those that we hear politicians speak about. We talk about macropolitics, macroeconomics, different ways of engaging in politics that many times involve very difficult conversations, involve skills that not necessarily young people want to pursue. They are top down. They don't necessarily feel like they are invited into conversations, that their visions are valid. And I think that affects young people around the world. There are issues that are affecting young people in terms of, does an education allow them to have the employment that they would like? Do they have the ability to save for a young age? And so I think we are in a moment where we're coming at the crossroads in terms of seeing how democracy is responding to the needs of people, but also making sure that young people feel that they will be supported in their pursuit of democratic ideas, participation, and the topics that affect them in their lives.
Great. You noted earlier that unfortunately no country is taking all of the steps to outlaw all forms of gender-based discrimination or violence, but is there a specific either country or jurisdiction or set of jurisdictions that you've seen making positive steps in this direction?
Yes, and we are so happy that tomorrow we will be presenting some of the results of our research and work with the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, because we put together a handbook on the elimination of discriminatory laws, but also on embedding in national legislation the principles of conventions like the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And so within that, within the mappings that we have done, because we also collect the data on the SDG 5 on discriminatory laws along with the World Bank. And so what we have seen are, for example, Malawi, a country that reformed its constitution to put one of the principles, gender equality. That really unfolds into all kinds of possible protection, legislation, resources, budgets to protect women and girls. We see, for example, legislation working on violence against women in different parts of the Pacific, in several parts of the Caribbean. So specific protections for domestic violence, specific protections against rape. We're seeing more and more the work, for example, in countries like Nepal to look at their legislation so that nationality can be conferred by women to their spouse and children. We see that as one of the key priorities, and there's still, as I was saying, 24 countries that need to reform their legislation. But we see progress in different aspects, also quota laws. So we have been able to track those, and we see that there are a few increasingly examples in all the aspects that have to do with women's lives. But for example, Jamaica amended its Domestic Violence Act to protect and increase penalties for breach of protection orders, which is something that women face all the time, with a maximum penalty, for example, of $10,000 or even up to $1 million. So it's really saying we are protecting the rights of women and girls. In Gabon, there is a long-term reform from 1970, where it has been increasingly looking at marital power, granting women equal rights to manage assets, ensuring equality in pensions, introducing parental leave for mothers and fathers. So those are all examples that really inspire us. In Sierra Leone, about employment and economic rights. In Fiji and Solomon Islands, on violence against women, and investing in comprehensive frameworks from shelters to services and to really increasing the penalties for perpetrators. So we see a positive trend.
Okay, great. I think maybe sticking with this idea of a positive trend or of progress, you had mentioned in the beginning of this interview how you were inspired to go into human rights by some of the structural barriers that were against women entering politics or in terms of making social change. When parliaments more closely resemble the populations they represent, do you see a material difference to how policy making or governance is done?
Definitely. I don't think we celebrate that enough. We see, for example, lots of women caucuses that really have committed to legislation that can really be a deal breaker for women and girls, and we're not necessarily telling those stories. We're sharing some other stories about politicians, but not when there are targeted efforts to really abide by, for example, conventions that a country has signed on to. And that's really what we want to be able to work together with the Commonwealth Secretariat. It is to align the universal principles of human rights with national legislation. And so, for example, Belize approved a national gender policy in 2024. And that has all kinds of effects also in terms of what the parliaments can be doing for women and girls with very concrete measures. It's not in general, but with concrete measures. So in Barbados, the adoption of an Employment Sexual Harassment Act is very relevant because it's saying not only domestic violence, but sexual harassment in all places where women work and operate. And so these are the kinds of very concrete examples that we don't often hear in the news.
Another aspect of your work is on the elimination of violence against women and girls. A recent CPA, AIPA, and IPU report found that 76% of women parliamentarians in Asia Pacific have experienced psychological violence, 25% sexual violence, and 24% economic violence. Could you speak a bit to how this issue might affect women parliamentarians and what steps you believe we can take to oppose this?
I think it's very important when you cite this data because we tend to think that violence against women affects some group of people, but the fact of the matter is that it is generalized, that it has been accepted for too long, and even normalized. And so when you bring together information about what's happening to different groups of women, we can really understand the depth and the acceptance that it has had for a very long time. So when I was working in Latin America as advisor on ending violence against women, it was very important to share that those people, sometimes in positions of decision-making, are also facing harassment. And unless you make it formal to say we do not tolerate any harassment in the workplace, we will not tolerate any political violence. More and more, we're seeing that some of the attacks against women leaders are hate crimes. They are crimes looking at the prevention of freedom of association, freedom of participation. And so for us, it's very important to name the different forms of violence, where they can occur in the home, in the workplace, even in public spaces, and make sure that everyone is aware and that there are measures taken to protect women and girls of all walks of life.
So sticking with that regional focus then, how did all of these issues that we've been talking about, so discriminatory laws, violence against women, women's political participation, change over time in the Caribbean and the Americas region as you were working there?
Yeah, so what we did, and I was just sharing with colleagues here in the Secretariat that we worked on aligning our work on femicide with the Convention of Belém do Pará of the Inter-American Human Rights System. It has a monitoring framework that all countries report to. And so this really helps because when we have a group of countries like the Commonwealth, we can really set standards and goals and discuss whether they're being met or not. In the case of femicide, we put together a model legislation on femicide, and we went from 8 countries in 2016 to now double those countries, 19, that have specialized model legislation on femicide, looking at human rights standards, protections for women, the investigation of femicide from a gender perspective. So to me, one of the most valuable things we can do is work as groups of countries, compare our results, learn from what works, and continue advancing those standards that we know we need to apply at every level.
Okay, and finally then, to go back to this event that you're participating in tomorrow, if you could have participants take away one message or one idea from that, what would it be?
It is that the future is in the hands of both female and male politicians that can be the guardians for universal human rights. For all, we cannot take for granted the democracies that we have, the judicial systems that we have to continue defending them. And the more aligned we are to universal human rights standards, the better chance we have to build a culture of resilience, to build a culture where people feel protected and in turn participate in politics. We cannot let private sector actors, other types of alliances take over what has costed us years and years to build. And I really am inspired by the ability of the Commonwealth to take a colonial legacy into rather promotion of human rights, promotion of collaboration, promoting economic ties. This, to me, is where we find a sense for collective work, as I was saying at the beginning. So this is what inspires me.
Great. Adriana Quiñones, thank you so much for joining me on this episode.
Thank you. It was great to be here with you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Parliamentary Conversations in the Commonwealth. To find out more about the CPA's work, visit our website at cpahq.org or follow us on one of our various social media channels at LinkedIn, Instagram, X, or Facebook.